Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kim Sager. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Communications. I first want to welcome you all to Fleet Management Awareness Month, just kicked off in January. And we're excited to have a few webinars this month for everybody to listen in and get some education. Today we have a presentation from Scott Conlon, and it's called Life Cycle Cost Analysis, Fleet Replacement Planning, and Total Cost of Ownership. Before we get started and I give you a little background about Scott, I just want to take care of some administrative things about the webinar. So first, everybody is in listen-only mode. So if you have a question for Scott during the presentation, enter it into the chat box. And then we can go over the questions. Probably towards the end of the presentation will be easier. This presentation is also recorded and will be posted on the MPMA YouTube channel later in the month if you guys want to share the presentation or view it again. Also, if there's anyone on the phone that is currently sitting with a group of folks, maybe in a conference room, if you send your all the group names and information to myself, we can get the CEU credits for everybody that's currently listening in the room. There's potential that just one person signed in, but multiple are in the room. So we want to be sure to give credit where it's due. Okay, so a little bit about our presenter. Scott is a managing director at the fleet management consulting firm Mercury Associates. He has worked on projects for clients representing federal, state, local government fleets, and was formerly a fleet administrator and fleet maintenance manager at Montgomery County, MD, Maryland. He currently holds 2 fleet management certifications, the MPMA Certified Federal Fleet Manager and the NAFA Certified Automotive Fleet Manager. While he was actively involved in maintenance shops, he was also certified as an ASE Master Technician. So welcome, Scott.
All right, well, thank you very much, Kim. So today we're going to talk about strategies for securing fleet replacement funding, and those are going to fall along the lines of conducting life cycle cost analysis, developing fleet replacement plans, and analyzing the total cost of ownership of the fleet, which is one of the key ways in which you can demonstrate the value in increasing fleet replacement spending because it has some benefits for your fleet in terms of making the fleet newer and more reliable and also more fuel efficient. So in developing a fleet replacement strategy, the key or the central issue in developing the strategy is that the fleet manager must show and the organization must accept that there is a link between fleet age and fleet costs. As fleet age increases, operating costs are also going to increase, and commensurately or conversely, if fleet age decreases, then you can expect a reduction in fleet operating costs. So it makes an increase in spending on replacement more palatable to folks who are allocating the budgets of the organization. The fleet manager must be able to demonstrate that older vehicles cost more than newer vehicles. This includes conducting life cycle cost analysis or optimal replacement cycle analysis. Those are kind of 2 terms that are synonymous. Developing a capital asset replacement cost analysis and a total cost of ownership analysis. So this is a lot of work involving pulling data from your fleet management information system or your fleet card system and analyzing it using various tools, most likely Excel. Also, once this is completed, one of the factors you might want to include in this is whether you're going to lease or buy your vehicles. So right here we have a visual representation of the life cycle costs of a vehicle. what we're seeing here, this is for a class of single axle dump trucks that Mercury performed a study for quite a few years ago. But this shows that at various ages or replacement cycles, capital costs, which is represented by the green line, decrease. So we all know that if you buy a new vehicle, it's going to lose the most value right when you drive it off the dealership lot, and then it's going to lose more value in the beginning years of its life cycle than it is at the end. Sort of when a vehicle's 10, 11, 12 years old, its value doesn't really decrease too much from year to year. Now, on the opposite side, we have operating costs, which increase year over year. Obviously, new vehicles are more likely to be under warranty. They have very few components that are going to wear out or be defective that aren't going to be covered by warranty. And that's going to keep those costs low for the first couple of years of the vehicle's life cycle. And then those costs are going to increase as the vehicle gets older and certain components start to wear out and require replacement. Additionally, you're going to be outside of the warranty period, so those costs are going to be borne by the organization rather than being warranty repairs covered by a dealership. And also, your operating costs, you might want to think about the fact that you may have costs associated with bringing the vehicle into the shop. If a vehicle breaks down on the road, you have costs associated with towing. And obviously, you have costs that are associated with maybe road calls and also the unpredictability of your maintenance program as vehicles have more and more unscheduled repairs. So if we combine those two lines together, we have the red line signifying the total cost of ownership for the vehicle. And what we see is that the total cost of ownership of the vehicle is lower in the middle of its life cycle than it is either at the beginning or the end. So what the objective of an effective fleet replacement strategy is to manage the fleet age so that it keeps the larger number of vehicles within those lower years in the middle of that replacement cycle graph. And that's accomplished through developing the strategy and being able to communicate it to decision makers, and then obviously receiving that funding, buying the vehicles, and then getting rid of them in a timely manner. So how are we going to go about getting this replacement funding? We're going to conduct analysis to identify those replacement cycles, and that's the first step in the process. So the objective is to identify the replacement cycle that results in the lowest total cost of ownership, and the approach that you're going to take is to quantify the key direct and possibly indirect costs of acquiring, using, maintaining, repairing, and disposing of a vehicle over a range of possible replacement cycles. Now, just introduce two terms there, direct and indirect costs. The direct costs are costs that are associated with individual vehicles. Those are typically capital costs. Those are the costs of owning the vehicle. And then maintenance, repair, and fuel costs, or the cost of operating the vehicle. And those are costs that you can tie to the operation of an individual vehicle. Now, there are also, organizations also have some indirect costs associated with vehicles where you don't necessarily tie the cost of, say, you have an asset manager in your fleet. Their salary is probably covered by some overhead costs. Now, if you increase the amount of vehicle replacements that you do on an annual basis, that person might have more work to do. Those are indirect costs. You may want to consider those in the process, but for the most part, when conducting life cycle cost analysis, you want to focus on those costs that are directly attributable to an individual vehicle. So here we have factors that you should include in a life cycle cost analysis. Again, we have capital costs, or the cost of owning the vehicle, and those include the purchase price of the vehicle, any upfitting costs, which are the costs of making a vehicle ready for service after you've received it. They can also be costs associated with making a vehicle ready before you receive it if you outsource those upfitting items on the vehicle. And what I mean by upfitting is, say you have a law enforcement vehicle and it requires a prisoner partition in the back. It requires lights and sirens. Nowadays, it's going to have a computer terminal, may have a dash camera. Obviously, it's going to have a radio, and there's going to be some cost associated with taking that base vehicle and installing all that equipment. And additionally, you have residual value, which is how much the vehicle is worth after a certain period of time. Those are the factors that you would need to think about, and those are represented by that original green line on the previous graph. Operating costs are the costs of maintenance or repair and fuel. And then you have other costs, which could be administrative costs of acquisition and disposal. For example, if you're paying for an auction house to get rid of your vehicles for you, then you may have to pay them a portion of the sales proceed. Also, you have registration fees and taxes, and then you may have some other factors that you might want to take into consideration. One of the things that we want to highlight here is a lot of organizations, they capture all of their costs maybe on a purchase card or in a fleet management information system through work orders and vendor sublets. And a best practice in the fleet management industry is to make sure that you are able to identify and separate your accident costs from your regular maintenance and repair costs. We don't want to include accident costs in a life cycle cost analysis because it's going to skew the data if we have some vehicles in there that may have a very expensive collision repair that shouldn't be taken into account when trying to figure out what the optimal life cycle is. So where does this cost data come from? Like I said, you have financial and property management systems. Those are usually systems that are not necessarily administered by the fleet management organization or the fleet management section within your organization. Those are usually the overarching financial and property systems. Purchase orders, contracts, and schedules. You might be using cost data from a schedule like a GSA schedule rather than having your own contracts to purchase vehicles. You also might want to look at vehicle and fuel purchase prices that you've paid historically. I'm sorry, the vehicle and fuel purchase prices that you have as part of your contracts. In the next data source, you have fuel and fleet card systems. That's where you have your historic data for maintenance and repair charges and fuel consumption and cost data. You also have agency fleet management information systems, or a good example of an interagency fleet management information system would be like FMAM that's managed by GSA. Those would include labor parts and sublet costs from work orders if you have an in-house maintenance program. So what that data is going to look like when it's exported from whatever system you're dealing with, this graph right here, the orange dots represent individual vehicles. The x-axis represents the age at which that vehicle was disposed of, and the y-axis represents the percentage of original value that vehicle retained after X number of years in service. So, for example, we might have a vehicle that has that was kept in service for 10 years and it retained 30% of the original purchase price after 10 years. So you can kind of calculate out what what would we predict those vehicles are going to sell for in the future. All of those orange dots together can be kind of averaged out. One method of doing that would be regression analysis to come up with this blue line, which is an equation that predicts what the future residual value for the vehicle would be for any particular year in the future. And that would, using that equation is what enables you to calculate those residual values and predict them in a more, in your total cost of ownership analysis, which we'll get to later. The next graph that we have here is a representation of maintenance and repair costs. Those costs are a lot more scattered. And what we have, again, on the x-axis, we have the number of years that the vehicle's in service. And on the y-axis, or actually the x-axis is the age of the vehicle at the time of the maintenance or repair record. And the y-axis is the amount of cost for that vehicle in total for the year for maintenance. So for example, an 8-year-old vehicle might cost $300. We would expect it to cost $300 a year to maintain for just maintenance or repair cost. And obviously there's some variability in the data. Some vehicles are going to require, going to have more cost. As you can see in the graph, we have a couple of vehicles that are 4 years old that had really high cost, and a couple of vehicles that are 8 years old that had really high cost. So that data kind of fluctuates. And what we have with the blue dots running across the graph is what our predicted value would be. How much would you expect to pay in maintenance or repair for an 8-year-old vehicle, for a 9-year-old vehicle, et cetera. And that is also going to be useful later in conducting a total cost of ownership analysis. So here we have an example of a table that is the output of a life cycle cost analysis. So across the top, we have replacement cycles, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, et cetera. We have the predicted meter value for that vehicle at each age. So we look at how many, you might look at how many average miles each vehicle in that class runs per year and use that as a predictor for how many miles it will have on it at ages in the future. Obviously, these are kind of low utilization vehicles. As you can see, after 10 years, they only have 63,000 miles on them. So this fleet has maybe some low utilization, and I seem to recall, without naming who the fleet belongs to, that some of the vehicles are used seasonally, which explains why they have kind of low utilization. Here we have capital cost factors. Again, we're talking about capital costs in terms of a percentage of the original acquisition cost of the vehicle. So we have 35% in year 8, 31% in year 9. And we can see what the residual value would be for those years, how much annual depreciation there is, which is the difference in residual value from year to year. And then we're not putting any ancillary costs into this factor, into this analysis right now. So we're just bringing that number down and having the capital costs there. So we can see the capital costs going across that darker blue line there. Operating costs, we have annual maintenance or repair cost, annual fuel cost, and that combined is a total operating cost. And we can just run some calculations, and we go down to the bottom in the light blue line. We see the total annual cost is running across the second to last line. And then if we average out those total annual costs over the period of retention for the vehicle, there's a calculation that we perform that translates that into equivalent annual cost. And what we're looking for is to minimize the equivalent annual cost. So if we back up to, let's see, this graph right here, the lowest spot on this graph is the annual total cost, where that is a minimum, where that red drops down to its lowest value. And what we're looking at with equivalent annual cost is that somewhere in this range between, say, on this graph, 6 and 9 years, is the point in time at which you want to get rid of that vehicle so that you can have the lowest overall cost of ownership for all years of the vehicle combined. And that's that calculation for equivalent annual cost. That's what we're looking at there. So as we can see in this particular example, and this is a real world situation, the fleet was retaining vehicles over here at 15 years. They were keeping vehicles to 15 years old, and each vehicle in the fleet was averaging $3,600 in cost per year. And if they actually increased their fleet spending on replacement, then and brought their vehicle fleet age down to 9 years for a replacement cycle, then that would translate to a lower equivalent annual cost. And we could expect that for every vehicle in the fleet, we're going to save, just doing some quick math, about $213 a year. So if you have a fleet of several thousand vehicles, $200 savings per year is going to add up. And that also, these are just direct costs. That also doesn't account for the fact that this doesn't even factor in the all the inconvenience of vehicles breaking down. It doesn't include the extra staff time involved with bringing vehicles to the shop. We didn't even include that in the calculation, and this is what we're seeing is a $213 a year difference. Here's what we have for an entire fleet. So we see a mix of classes here. And this kind of shows what I was just talking about a little bit more clearly. So we have, this was a 16,427 vehicle fleet. And obviously a couple thousand vehicles in each of these categories. What they were typically doing in this fleet was they had a current replacement cycle for vehicles ranging from 9 years up to looks like 14, 15 years. And in conducting the life cycle cost analysis for each class, we found that it would be advantageous to drop these replacement cycles down. So what they were probably averaging out to about 12 years, and they needed to have a weighted replacement cycle average of about 8. We figured out what the costs would be, average costs under operating cost under each of the current cycles, and what they would be under each of the recommended cycles, and then calculated what the difference would be for each one. Obviously, some classes there was a smaller difference in the range of $200. But then for some of their other classes, they had the opportunity to save about $10,000 a vehicle on those larger classes. And I think this is a state fleet, so they have a pretty large contingent of trucks that are used for plowing highways. 2,396 heavy single axle and tandem axle dump trucks. Obviously, there was some significant cost with those types of assets running on the roads, and you can see going over on the right-hand side what the cost savings would be if you took the number of units and multiplied it times the average annual operating cost savings per vehicle to get the total average annual operating cost savings. And by increasing fleet replacement spending for this particular fleet and getting those replacement cycles down to where they should be and managing that total cost of ownership, this fleet had an opportunity to save approximately $30 million a year in operating costs, which is pretty significant. Obviously, the bulk of that is associated with the heavy-duty trucks, since they were so far outside of an appropriate replacement cycle to begin with. So more considerations in talking about life cycle cost analysis. One of the key factors in doing this is the internal cost data accessibility and accuracy. And that includes maintenance and technician labor costs, parts management costs, sublet repair management costs, asset management and administration costs, and activity-based costing for other indirect costs. So what I mean by accessibility and accuracy, some of the things that affect accessibility is whether you have a good fleet management information system, you have analysts that are capable of pulling the information out of the system, and then by accuracy, what I mean is, kind of along the same lines as what the federal government has been doing with vehicle level data reporting, that there's been really a focus on improving the accuracy of fleet data government-wide. And so if you have inaccurate data in your system, then it's obviously going to hamper or hinder your ability to conduct life cycle cost analysis and be able to trust the results as being accurate and usable for making your case for more fleet replacement funding. Other considerations include your assumptions, inflation rates, fuel efficiency penalty for retaining older vehicles. So what we mean by inflation is, obviously we're all familiar with the idea that costs go up over time. And when conducting an analysis that looks out over a long time horizon, there are inflation rates that should be taken into consideration. If somebody is going to conduct these analyses, the federal government actually prescribes that in certain inflation rates are used in life cycle cost analyses via an OMB circular, which I think is numbered A94. They publish an update every year that says what inflation rates are supposed to be used when conducting life cycle cost analysis. Fuel efficiency, that is related to the fact that due to the CAFE regulations, the corporate combined average fuel economy regulations, that vehicles have been improving in fuel economy over the last 3 or 4 decades very significantly, and that if you're going to retain older vehicles, you're going to spend more in fuel because those older vehicles are going to burn more fuel than if you had replaced that vehicle with a newer one. And that's what we mean by a fuel efficiency penalty. And then a discount rate, which is more applicable for fleets that are maybe not federal government fleets, but ones that are commercial or local government fleets that are actually issuing bonds to pay for fleet replacement. This is kind of a treasury function. We don't really have to worry about that too much in most analyses. An additional factor to consider is the sensitivity analysis of key assumptions. So what I mean by that is if we look at maintenance and repair labor that's recorded on work orders in a garage, one of the key assumptions that we look at is how much per hour you pay your mechanics, or how much per hour you record as a cost for employing your mechanics. And what we find within Mercury, we do a lot of studies of fleets of different types, is one of the key things that affects this analysis is what the internal cost of labor is for the fleet management organization. So an example I'll give you is we worked with a client up in New York, and this is in the New York City metropolitan area, and they were only recording that their mechanics working on heavy trucks would cost them $60 an hour. When we actually looked at all of their fully burdened labor cost, salary, fringe benefits, and these are unionized employees, so they have pretty decent benefits, and they have a very high cost of living based on their geography, it was actually costing more on the order of $150 an hour to employ a mechanic. So obviously, the maintenance or repair cost curve is going to be heavily affected by whether you say that a mechanic's time is worth $60 an hour, or if it's worth, say, almost 3 times that. The higher the cost of labor that's recorded in the system, the more likely it's going to support an acceleration of replacement cycles and an increase in fleet replacement spending. And then conversely, if you are artificially recording a very low labor cost for your mechanics, then vehicles become more precious and mechanic labor is not, and that tends to support longer replacement cycles. So that's one of the things that organizations tend to do, which might hinder their own ability to argue for more fleet replacement funding, is they have an artificially low cost of labor. So, so if we do a sensitivity analysis, how does the life cycle recommendation change if we say take $80 an hour, $90 an hour, $100 an hour as your mechanics labor? Okay, so now that we've gone through the optimal replacement cycle analysis, the next step in the process is to develop a plan that quantifies long-term fleet replacement costs and asset ages. So there's a couple steps in this process. Obviously, this hinges on replacing the assets that you have in your fleet inventory. So you need to obtain that from whatever system you're using. Categorize assets by type, purchase price, and any unique operating characteristics. And what I mean by unique operating characteristics is, lots of organizations have SUVs, but they can be used for a lot of different purposes. So an SUV that's used by a canine police officer is going to be used, configured, and may have a different replacement cycle than a same model SUV that's used by a fire chief, for example. And then the next part, once you have them categorized, is to establish planning parameters for each asset category. And that includes a recommended replacement cycle. Obviously, that's what you want to take from your, as an output from your optimal replacement cycle analysis, your life cycle cost analysis. That's what you do with that information, is you use those replacement cycles as an input into your replacement plan. Purchase prices to replace those assets, and then also an inflation rate. So how much do you anticipate that those prices are going to go up over time? Again, federal government publishes standards for what you should use as an inflation factor. Apply those parameters to the fleet inventory to project future replacement dates and costs for each asset in the fleet. So this is, a bunch of spreadsheet work. It requires, some familiarity with Microsoft Excel. There are obviously tools out there to do it. So that's essentially the 4 key steps of the replacement plan process. So here are some examples of replacement cycles. You can see that we have a couple different classes of vehicles, looks like about 8 or 9, and they have a range of replacement cycles from 84 months all the way out to 144, depending on what the asset is. Obviously, lighter automotive vehicles are going to tend to have shorter replacement cycles than more expensive specialized equipment. So the rate of technological change for vehicles, for light duty autos, is greater. They usually tend to get used year round, and therefore they get worn out relatively quickly, relative to specialized equipment, which may be only used seasonally, like excavators or backhoes or something like that. Here's another example of purchase prices for the same types of assets. Obviously, these are kind of low purchase prices, but you can see that the higher dollar value assets are typically associated with the longer replacement cycles. That just makes sense economically. So in developing replacement plans, what we always find is that there's a need to develop a couple different types of replacement plans, and this is done in order to evaluate alternatives or alternative courses of action based on how much funding you think you're going to get, or to demonstrate what the result will be under different scenarios. So the first plan that we usually look at is a baseline plan, and what we mean by baseline plan is you just take these replacement cycles, you apply them to the vehicles in the fleet, you calculate out when the vehicles are going to be replaced, figure out what year, what budget cycle is each one of your vehicles in your fleet going to require funding to purchase it. And that's the baseline plan. What we always find is that it's kind of volatile. There's peaks and valleys in the need to replace vehicles based on just the utilization of the vehicles since they were acquired. And if there was volatile spending on fleet replacement in the past, then we have every expectation that there's going to be a volatile need for fleet replacement funding in the future. So it kind of goes up and down. It's hard to plan under that scenario. So what we recommend is to come up with a modernization plan that's smooth. And this is showing a kind of a constant dollar value being thrown at the fleet over, say 5 to 10 years that will allow you to buy out the backlog of fleet replacement over, say, multiple budget cycles, rather than trying to address the backlog all at once. If you try to address the backlog all at once, it's just going to cause problems in the future. If you address the backlog over, 3, 5, 8, 10 years, it tamps down the volatility in your fleet replacement spending and smooths things out. And then just to show what is the cost of doing nothing, if you don't address the situation with increased fleet replacement funding, then we develop what's called a status quo plan. And that shows the effects of continuing to underspend on fleet replacement. So here we have 3 scenarios. So the baseline plan, we can see here, and it's kind of a little bit of an eye chart, but essentially we have what is the budget requirement for replacing vehicles that are overdue that are either currently overdue or are going to become overdue in the first year of the replacement plan. And then what does that look like for vehicles coming due for replacement or forecasted to come due for replacement in each year subsequent to that. Essentially they have a backlog here of $84 million worth of vehicles that need to be replaced. So if they tried to replace $84 million worth of vehicles in a single year, then they're not going to have enough. First off, they're probably not going to get the funding to be able to do that. And secondly, they probably don't have enough staff to be able to process all the paperwork to buy the vehicles, to get them delivered, to get the old vehicles out to auction, to clean up all the records, and to essentially manage the process, because the amount of staff time that it takes to process $84 million worth of vehicles is significantly greater than the amount of staff time to process $13 million worth of vehicles a year, which is what they've been doing on average for every year in the past. So that would obviously not be an operationally or financially feasible plan to propose. Now, what if we were to take this huge replacement cycle here and try to spread that out over a couple of years and try to address it over time, say 10 years? Well, that would look like an increase to $25.8 million per year from $13.2 million, almost doubling their fleet replacement spending, but definitely not quadrupling, quintupling their replacement spending. This would be a more manageable approach to getting the fleet healthy over time. Also, what you'll notice here is that this volatility right here, this spike in the 10th year or 11th year of the plan, is kind of an echo of this initial spike up here, because all these vehicles are on a 10-year replacement cycle. If you smooth this out, then that line kind of continues over into the future, that there's not a lot of volatility from year to year. And what we'd actually would recommend would be kind of just to keep along the same line right there and replace vehicles at about $25.8 million per year. We're adjusting upwards here for a little bit of inflation, but that's kind of the number to start off with. Now, if they continue to spend $13.2 million per year for 10 years in the future, then all they're doing is pushing that spike out, and the backlog now is $80-something million. And if they don't do anything, in 10 years it's going to be $140 million. I don't think any manager wants, when presented with this information, wants to be the person to say, you know what, I'm going to kick the can down the road for the next person. I think everybody would want to try to address this problem by getting the replacement funding in place and moving forward with a smooth modernization plan. So all of this is done for the purposes of managing asset age, because asset age is what translates into reliability. So the average asset age under modernization and status quo plans. So if we said we're going to keep the status quo, then the fleet age represented by this blue line in years out into the future is just going to continue to rise. So by the time you get to an average asset age of, looks like 8.9, what that really translates to is that if you assume that your fleet is kind of uniformly distributed in ages, then if you double what this average age is, then you would probably be getting rid of vehicles when they're at about 16 to 18 years old, which is signified by the average age being about 8 to 9. So we kind of double that and have a rough estimate of what you're actually doing with your vehicles. The orange line here is your modernization plan. That's actually going to bring your fleet age down. And obviously, if you get to the point where your average age is about 4, that means you are actually getting rid of vehicles that are at about 8 years old. And that's where you want to be for this particular scenario. Okay, now that we've got the replacement plan completed, the next step is to basically say, well, here's the requirement for the funding. We're going to increase our spending on replacement, but I want to show to the decision makers, here's how much we can save by doing this. So it may not be an outright direct increase in replacement spending. If you increase replacement spending by 10 million, you're going to get some return on that investment. You want to be able to quantify that because that makes it a better sell. So many fleet costs are a function of age. Assuming fleet utilization remains constant, decreases in fleet age are going to correspond to increased used asset sales proceeds. So you're getting rid of those vehicles before they suffer more depreciation. Decreased maintenance or repair costs. You've got vehicles that have fewer components that are wearing out. You have vehicles that are making less frequent trips to the shop. And probably when they go to the shop, it's for more predictable things and less unpredictable types of repairs. Then you also have decreased fuel costs because you're driving more efficient vehicles. One of the other factors we might throw in here is this is something that you might want to consider in your life cycle cost analysis as well, is activity-based costing can be used to allocate many indirect costs to cost pools that are age dependent. And what do I mean by that? So some organizations, some fleet management organizations might have a flat monthly fee that they assess for fleet users, regardless of how old a vehicle is. And when you have situations like that, it tamps down the cost of keeping old vehicles in the fleet. It hides it. It makes that cost less visible. Activity-based costing is a way of making those costs more visible. And if you can make those costs visible in such a way that they're age dependent, it actually helps you make that argument more for fleet replacement funding. Okay. Here we have an example of maintenance or repair costs as a result of a total cost of ownership analysis. We're, again, taking the asset ages that we found from the replacement plan and combining that with the equations that we would have developed in the replacement cycle analysis, and we can use that to predict what the M&R costs are going to be for each year in the future for the fleet, depending on how old the fleet is. So the blue line, if we don't spend enough money on replacement, the blue line is going to show that our maintenance or repair costs are going to continue to climb year over year. The orange line, if we increase spending on fleet replacement, is going to signify that we're going to spend less on maintenance repair year over year. So that helps you show that there's a couple $1 million difference in operating costs between an older and a newer fleet. Additionally, we have fuel costs. Now, this is a little bit counterintuitive maybe with the fuel cost is when compared with the M&R graph, one goes up and one goes down. Fuel costs, they both go down, but modernization is going to go down quicker. And the reason for that is that even if you're underspending on fleet replacement, your fleet is still getting newer. You still are enjoying some benefit of replacing some vehicles in your fleet with newer, more fuel efficient models. You're just not getting as many of them. You're not getting as much bang for the buck. So in modernization, the fuel costs will go down as well. Okay. Now we have to look at alternative methods of financing fleet modernization costs. And so all that we've looked at so far is we've got an increase in fleet replacement spending, which happens kind of at the beginning of a vehicle's life cycle. And that is for the benefit of decreasing your operating costs, which happens kind of over the course of the life cycle of the vehicle. So we have high costs up front, and then some cost savings that are spread out into the future. What typically happens is that organizations see those high costs up front as being a significant barrier to actually accomplishing their fleet replacement strategy. One of the ways to get around that is to actually lease vehicles. So in the federal government, there's vehicles can be leased through GSA. They can be leased commercially. However, commercial leasing in the federal government is typically more expensive and is usually only done for vehicles. Maybe 1 or 2% of the total federal fleet is commercially leased. If we're talking about leasing in state and local governments and commercial, it's actually way more common than it is in the federal government. What that does is it allows the organization, the fleet management organization, to pay for the asset over the life of the asset rather than paying all those capital costs up front. So it realigns the capital cost spending to the same periods of time where you're achieving an operating cost savings, and it eliminates or reduces that barrier to replacement that I was just talking about. So there's a couple ways to go about doing this. What we have here is kind of a table that's part of a spreadsheet analysis on a particular class of vehicles. And what we have are all these yellow cells are inputs of what you would want to include in a lease versus buy analysis. So you'd have, all this is specific to a class. You have data on these vehicles relating to purchase prices, upfitting costs, annual mileage, what your replacement cycle is going to be for the vehicle, miles per gallon, and also you're looking at how many of these vehicles are there in the fleet. And we have commercial lease rate and lease terms if we are actually going to look at commercial leasing as an option. Also, GSA end-of-life chargebacks, if those can be predicted, those are something that you would want to consider. And down at the bottom, we have something called VEUs. That's a term that's used in the fleet management industry to describe vehicle equivalent units. Those are just a way of estimating maintenance and repair costs for vehicles. We have estimated residual value, fuel cost, et cetera. So you can see these are a bunch of assumptions that can be used in the analysis. Now, if we look at the results of this analysis, we would look at an owned vehicle, and we would use those cost factors from our life cycle cost analysis, and we would compare those to a GSA lease vehicle over the same term of ownership, over the same period of usage. So, for example, if I was going to own a vehicle for 10 years, I would want to look at how much would it cost me to lease the equivalent GSA vehicle for 10 years as well. We have a predicted maintenance or repair costs, predicted fuel cost, the cost of managing the vehicle, it's agency staff costs, and then this is comparing to the maintenance and fuel charges estimated for the vehicle based on the mileage rates and some costs for managing the vehicle. And we can look at these side by side and see that in this particular scenario, it looked like GSA leasing was favorable. This is kind of a graphic representation of what it might look like as far as how much money the agency is spending year over year by approaching their fleet replacement strategy through two different funding sources. The blue bars are the replacement costs of the agency purchasing the vehicle, and the red line signifies what the lease payments would be for the equivalent amount of purchased vehicles. So obviously the lease payments creep up over time, and in some years they're higher than what the purchases are, but those are in the out years. Really, the difference here is between the top of these blue lines, blue bars, and the red line is the amount of vehicles that you're able to purchase or to enjoy the usage of new vehicles without actually spending the money to do so. Okay, so now that we've gone through all of that, we've got a couple minutes to take some questions if anybody has some, and I'll leave my contact information up there and I guess turn it back over to Kim.
Thanks, Scott. I am not seeing any questions at this moment, but I might not be able to since I'm not an organizer. Rebecca, I hate to put you on the spot at this moment, but can you see any questions in there that maybe I'm not seeing as a panelist?
Yeah, a question did come through.
Thank you.
On one of the slides, I'm not sure what slide this was, but it says, the person says that they did not see insurance listed. Do you also include insurance in the life cycle cost? I'm sorry, I don't have more.
The federal government self-insures, so it probably would be, we're probably talking about, not this one, this slide right here. So if federal government usually self-insures. If we're talking about an organization that insures vehicles, if they get a different rate, insurance rate for newer vehicles than they would for older vehicles, then you would probably want to consider that. I know for just private vehicle ownership, newer vehicles may tend to cost more to insure because they cost more to repair. So that would be something that I would leave on this slide if I was presenting to an audience that wasn't more geared towards federal government. So because I was presenting to this audience, I removed that from the slide. So to answer the question, if they are paying insurance, if it's like a commercial, the person's part of a commercial enterprise, then I would include insurance in this life cycle cost analysis, yes.
Okay, let's see here. Someone asked if they could get a copy of the charts. Is that something you would?
Yeah, I think, well, the charts are going to be included in the, is this going up on PDF, and it's also going up as a recorded webinar? So it will be online, right?
It will be online as a recorded webinar.
Yeah, and if they want to contact me, I can talk to them if they want to contact me. Put my email. Oops, it jumps back out of the slideshow. Let me put my contact information back up. If they want some of this information, they can go ahead and shoot me an email, and I'll get back to them.
And one final question. While staying in the 6 to 9 year age of a vehicle, do you have issues purchasing less than brand new vehicles?
in terms of purchasing used vehicles for the fleet, I would say that not a whole lot of fleets purchase used vehicles. The usual exception that I find is just working in municipal government. What I typically found in terms of purchasing old vehicles was two scenarios. One, purchasing used vehicles for undercover work, and the other being purchasing used vehicles because there was a specialized type of vehicle that that had a long lead time and we needed replacement vehicles for them. I don't typically see a whole lot of fleets purchasing used vehicles as part of their replacement strategy. I think the idea would be that when dealing with public contracting, it's a little bit harder to ensure that you're able to evaluate bids for the cheapest vehicles when vehicles are of all different ages and configurations. Typically, when buying vehicles, you might have a spec for a vehicle, and that would go out to a bunch of different contractors who would then match that spec and provide a price. And you may lose the ability to compare the relative value of different proposals if you start purchasing used vehicles. So it's, like I said, it's typically something that's done in low volume and for a specific purpose, either an emergency procurement or something that's done as a low volume, like law enforcement undercover type vehicles that are there to fill a specific purpose. Hopefully I answered that question. If somebody has a follow-up, they can obviously contact me via email or phone.
And that's all the questions we received, Kim.
Thanks, Rebecca. I appreciate you stepping in for me. I can't see them. So I just want to say thank you to Scott for a great presentation today. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And we will be posting the recording on our MPMA YouTube channel. You can get to that through our MPMA website. We're probably just looking it up through YouTube. And there are more webinars to come. We have one next Wednesday, the 15th, and then one, I believe, on the 23rd. So if you haven't registered yet, you can go on to our MPMA site and get registered for those as well. So thank you again, Scott, for your time. And everybody, I hope you have a great afternoon.
All right, thank you.